Hello everyone, and thanks for joining in on another episode here on the Roban 800 412 helicopter. So in this video, I don't know if you guys saw the first video, we covered a little bit of the work I had to do in the fuselage. For you guys that are just joining me in, we're actually going to be covering, it's kind of like a mini build series, just not in detail. If you want to see it in detail, I'm going to have links down below for my build threads on both RC groups and Run Rider. If you guys do want to follow those, again, those go in a lot more detail. Once you do have the main fuse complete, as I showed in my previous video, you're going to want to work on the tail. So one of the main things, there's a torque tube in this tail that's obviously a lot bigger, a lot longer than this. This is for the small section here, but it looks the same, just obviously the full length. You're going to want to make sure, you're going to notice two support bearings. The two support bearings in the manual, they recommend them to space them out evenly. Personally, I wouldn't do that. I'd actually space them out about 20 millimeter offset towards either the front or the rear, as long as they're both going in the same direction. The main reason for that, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but for the harmonics, if you guys understand the way harmonics work on a dual support, if it was supported in two positions, they would run like that. So the whole point is for you not to have the bearings where there would be harmonics, because that could cause obviously vibration. But gluing it in is very simple. For this, you do use CA. Now, before you do glue in the torque tube, I recommend you clean it with alcohol, because obviously when they do cut this, they do have oils they put on them for when they're cutting. So I'd recommend to clean it with alcohol, slide your bearings over to your marked positions, again 20 millimeter offset either towards the rear or towards the front. Once you do have those marked, I'd slide the bearing back just a hair, put some medium CA around it. You need very, very little, and then slide the bearing right over, and it should pretty much stay in place. Now you want to be careful not to use too much CA, as too much CA will cause it to possibly overflow onto the bearing, thus potentially causing it to seize up, and that won't be a good day for you. You're probably going to need to get more bearings. So be very careful when doing that. Don't use too much CA. And again, I use medium. It worked great. Once you are done with that, you're going to slide in the boom inside to the front. Now I noticed for me personally it was easier to remove the brackets, only because I was able to, you can't see it here, but there's a clamp, it's a clamp style mechanism, so you're able to slightly open it to allow the boom to slide in. You can probably do it without getting them out, but it helped obviously removing them. Now it's going to be important you pay attention. The boom does have a cutout on the front, and the receiving end of the torque tube block, you can't see it, but it's here in the front. The receiving end has a notch only on, I believe, the left side of the helicopter. I don't know if it's the left or the right. It's been a few days since I put it together, but you want to pay attention to that. So if you are putting it in wrong, it's not going to slide in all the way. Once you do have that in, you can go ahead and slide in your servo mounts, followed by only one of the rod supports, then your tail boom support bracket, followed by the other link support here. Then you can finally slide in the tail assembly. If you don't do it in that order, it's going to be very difficult to do it after, so just be sure you do that. Now would also be a good time to Loctite, and we're actually going to get on that topic, Loctite all your screws for your support booms. Now one really good thing is the whole head assembly for this helicopter. I noticed the whole head assembly is Loctited. I went through it two times. Everything, they went ahead and actually used really good Loctite, which is very good. I would still go through them just to make sure they did do it, but pretty much the whole head assembly, pretty much from here on up to the head, I noticed they did put Loctite. Now they didn't put any Loctite down here. So now would be a good time to go through them. When you are putting Loctite, I recommend you clean the screws themselves with alcohol, then obviously use about 243 or 242 Loctite, and that should be plenty. Now guys, you don't need a crazy amount of Loctite. You barely need any on maybe 2 to 3 threads worth, so you don't need a lot. Some of the smaller screws you risk actually stripping them, so be very careful. Once you are done with that, again, if you haven't slid in the tail assembly, gear assembly here, now's a good time. It's important you pay attention that the longer side goes to the longer end of the boom, and the shorter side goes to this section of the boom. Now, the booms themselves, this one you can see because it's off, they do have holes in them, indentation holes, and there's receiving end. It's kind of hard to pick up, but there's an indentation right there. It's hard because there's no light going in there, but there's an indentation here on the left. So you're going to want to make sure this has the same thing. You're going to want to make sure that actually grabs onto the right position, and then pretty much you can screw your front assembly down, and you can wait for your rear. Now before you get onto the rear on attaching it, obviously the rear tube doesn't have a support, a bearing support that is. It doesn't need to be supported, so you can just very simply slide that bad boy in. Now before you do assemble the whole tail assembly into the helicopter, I really recommend you guys put a little bit of work on making this thing as slop free and no binding as possible. So you're going to notice, and again, if I go into pretty deep detail in the thread, but where you have binding is on these little plastic arms here, and there's a little brass bushing that sits on the inside. So really either the brass bushing needs to be slightly enlarged so the bushing can fit in there snugly, or in this case I had to do both. You have to shave off or sand off a little bit of the arm on this side, so when you clamp these metal clamps, it clamps onto the brass and not the plastic fitting, thus making it bind up. So I don't know if that makes any sense. And it's also very important when you're installing this again, you went through all that work, do not put Loctite on the screw, because by you putting Loctite on the screw then forcing it in, you run the risk of Loctite coming out, grabbing onto the plastic and the brass bushing, thus causing more binding. So what I would recommend for you guys is to grab your Loctite, put a little bit on a pin, and then you put the Loctite from the rear with this pin you have here. So you'd apply a little bit of Loctite here, put it from the rear of the threads. That'll guarantee that no Loctite gets bound up, thus all that work you went through making it nice and smooth, obviously not be so smooth. Once you are happy with it, you can go ahead and pretty much fix it to the helicopter. Now you are going to have to remove this when you put the fuse on, but I like doing it. I'm actually going to set up the helicopter without the fuse because obviously it's easier to make adjustments if I need to make them. When you are installing this, just make sure that again there is an indentation right here. It only has it on one side on the tail. For this specific helicopter, the rotor is actually on the left side, so it would insert like this. This is very straightforward. Now one of the last things you can work on is putting your servos in the helicopter. Obviously the tail one is pretty straightforward. You can see it here. I also spaced my supports out equally, used a little bit of Loctite to press fit them in place. Then later I'll just cut them off here and here so you don't see any excess of the zip ties themselves. Now one thing I did have to do, I noticed when I first installed the servos, they actually were bottoming out on this plate right here on the bottom. Before they would bottom out on the mount, they were touching here, which wouldn't allow them to fully be screwed on to the servo mounts. So what I had to do is slightly raise up this mount, so obviously it barely bottoms out here. All I really had to do is bring these holes higher, and I actually made a wooden template for that. The reason I did that, so I'm able to replicate it on both sides, and you can see the original hole was there, so it's slightly up into the rear. Same one here. It's a little bit hard to see on video, but you can see that. So once you have your servos installed, you can set them up to be a perfect 90, as close as you can get it, to the servo body as well. Get your bell cranks at a perfect 90. Then it wouldn't be a bad idea to get a swash leveler up here, and obviously making sure that everything is nice and leveled. I noticed the T-Rex 700 is the same size shaft as this bad boy, so all you have to move is the remove your anti-rotation bracket, making sure to not lose the orientation of this guy, because obviously there is a correct way of doing it. With the four-bladed head, you can throw it out of phase if you don't pay attention to it. But that's very simple. Remove here and remove the set screw here, and the whole thing comes off, allowing the what do you call it, the swash leveler to go into place. Now if you don't have a swash leveler, kind of like the cheap way to do it is with zip ties. You wrap a zip tie around here, and then you use whatever you cut off from the zip tie to make contact here on the arm, so you kind of make like a T angle. I don't know if that makes any sense to you guys, but that can be another way you can do it. There's tons of videos online showing them. If you guys do have a question about it, I can actually, describe it down in the description. So really the only part that's left really to do to the helicopter is obviously add your flight control, add your motor and ESC. It goes you know, I got to figure out where I got to put all that. And obviously just slide on the boom. So in the next video, I'm probably going to be showing you guys how to get the boom slid on, get that ready to go before we add the rest of the mechanics. And yeah guys, surprisingly, to get to this step, it's probably taken me about 3 hours. And that's probably because I've been trying to take a lot of pictures and you know, so I can do my build thread. If I wasn't doing that build thread and taking all those pictures, I probably would have had it done a lot sooner. But yeah, on average, really to get to the step I've gotten here so far with all the mechanics done and the fuse itself done, it'll take you about 2.5, 3 hours. So really, if you had everything in hand, you can have one of these bad boys flying easily within a weekend. The servos I did end up going with are pretty much MKS all around. You'll notice a few companies such as Motion RC that distribute these helicopters actually recommend the MKS servos. I actually went with better servos than they recommend. Ideally speaking, for a helicopter like this, about 300 ounces of torque should be enough for cyclic. These MKS X5, they're actually the HBL 550s. These have over 500 ounces of torque, so that's more than enough power for these guys. Brushless, you know, you'll get really long life out of them. They're really smooth, they operate great. I mean, you know, if you want something that's a lot nicer than they're recommending, these bad boys will surely get the job done. Now for the tail, I am running the digital, again brushless, so pretty much this whole setup will work on 2-cell LiPo. So I didn't want to have a regulator, I just obviously want to eliminate as many points of failure as I can. So I'm running the 980 tail servo. It's a really it's a really fast tail servo. It's kind of hard to see the specs on it, but just trust me, it's an HBL 980. And that's kind of what I'm running for the tail. So if you're looking for a really nice, really reliable, I'm pretty sure if you do any reading whatsoever, you'll quickly realize that MKS servos are, in the helicopter industry, they're really well-known and respected servos. So we're going to wrap that video up, guys. I really hope you guys got some pointers if you are assembling your Roban or pretty much any, not your 412, but any helicopter by Roban. It should be pretty similar mechanism. So a lot of the same stuff I talked about here will probably apply to that. Obviously, if you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns, please leave them down in the comment box below. I thank each and every one of you very much for watching. As always, happy flying.